Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here to end the debate on icons. So I have my presentation ready. This is a version of the presentation that I gave on Dustin Quick's channel not too long ago. And I basically updated it, added a few things, and the contents of this presentation, the research that you're going to see, two things about it. The first is that the research I did here was done during my time at Harvard. I was able to sit down with some professors from the classics department, from the divinity school, to look over my research and talk about the subject matter at hand. The second thing is that the research that is here, only a sliver of it, you're not getting all of it because it's a lot, that is going to be published with Brianna Elise Jansky's and Daniel Jansky's publishing house called The Catholic Quill. I think we talked about there being a release, I think next calendar year, sometime then. And you're going to get these two giant essays from me that goes in depth on the issue of icon veneration. So I'm very excited to give you at least a sliver of what my research contains. And on top of that, I'm hoping that this presentation is enough to be helpful without giving everything away. So let me put my presentation up on the screen. I think everybody can see it now. And I think I'm just going to go right ahead as long as everyone can hear me all right. I think everything is clear. I don't think there are any issues. All right, so let's get right into this. Ending the icons debate. So the contents for today's presentation, I'm going to offer a new piece of evidence for icon veneration from the late 2nd century. And then I'll go into some arguments for whether Nicaea II allows for development and whether Nicaea II is a valid development. The first question, does Nicaea II allow for development, is the first essay that I contributed to Brianna Elise Jansky and Daniel Jansky's book. The second question down there is the second essay, which is much longer, and it deals with directly the theology and historicity of image veneration. But just to get everyone excited on this new piece of evidence, this slide is not the new piece of evidence. It's an old piece of evidence that Gavin Ortlund brought up against image veneration. And basically, Irenaeus and Against Heresies here doesn't seem to have a very positive view of what the Gnostics are doing with images. So let me just quote Irenaeus. Quote, "Others of them employ outward marks, branding their disciples inside the lobe of the right ear. From among these also arose Marcellina, who came to Rome under the episcopate of Anicetus, and holding these doctrines, she led multitudes astray. They style themselves Gnostics. They also possess images, some of them painted and others formed from different kinds of material. While they maintain that a likeness of Christ was made by Pilate at that time when Jesus lived among them. They crown these images and set them up along with the images of the philosophers of the world. That is to say, with images of Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and the rest. They have also other modes of honoring these images after the same manner of the Gentiles, or another translation says, the pagans." I want to make clear here that even though Irenaeus is speaking negatively about this group, it does show you that something like image veneration is happening in the 180s AD, late 2nd century. Of course, ideally, and I'm going to be totally transparent here, it would have been nice if it was this Orthodox group and that Irenaeus is praising them for doing this. Right? And Gavin obviously is using this source to defend the interpretation that among somebody like Irenaeus, this bastion of orthodoxy, he seems to not be a big fan of the practice of image veneration, which is clearly attested here at the end of the 2nd century. Now, of course, the question we could ask is this more so having to do with what the Gnostics are? Like if Irenaeus saw a group of Orthodox Christians venerating images and he was able to vet that they believed in the apostolic teachings and preaching, that they were maintaining the authority of apostolic succession, would he then conclude, okay, you know what, maybe this is a little bit different here. But given the fact that they're Gnostics and they're Gentiles, I'm going to use this against them. And on top of that, I don't know of any Orthodox Christian, whether Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, who would put up and venerate images of the Lord and the apostles alongside images of Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle. So that is just to say that there's a lot going on here, even in this quote, that we don't really know about, or that I wish I could press Irenaeus on and ask more questions about. And so I want to be careful here how strong my conclusions are, at least with respect to Irenaeus. But I have an interesting source here and it's the Acts of John. Now, I have this meme up here because some people might be wondering, okay, wait, Acts of John, Acts of John. Wait, that's the text that Nicaea II condemned. So why is Suan citing from this condemned source? Well, the reason why that you'll see shortly is, one, it does give evidence again of image veneration at the end of the 2nd century. But because Acts of John is a heretical source, it's a source that has a bad Christology. It condemns image veneration on the basis of its, well, not just its heretical Christology, but its heretical view of the invisible and visible world. So there's actually valuable evidence here that's worth considering. So let me get into it. This is from my essay, which is forthcoming. The 2nd century apocryphal text, Acts of John, also provides backhanded evidence for the making and veneration of images. In this story, St. John the Beloved is surprised to find a painting of someone in Lycomedes' possession, accusing him of, quote, still living like a pagan, end quote. Lycomedes, a pagan convert to Christianity, explains himself to St. John, saying, "He alone is my God, who raised me from the dead together with my spouse. But since after God, those men who are our benefactors ought to be called gods, it is you yourself who are painted in the image, whom I crown, kiss, and venerate as having become my good guide." Okay, so leaving aside some of Lycomedes' other claims about viewing the apostles as gods, he is crowning, kissing, and venerating the images. When was this text dated? Well, Father Richard Price, in the first footnote below, dates the composition of this text soon after 150. Now, there are some complications because there is a redaction history of this text. Different parts were added later from what we can tell. And I have the source down there in the book Commission Narratives, a comparative study of the canonical and apocryphal Acts. Leaving that to one side, we can safely say, for the sake of this conversation, 2nd half of the 2nd century. That's when this text is written. That's when you start seeing image veneration explicitly appear in the record. To the last sentence on this page. The text then has John chastise Lycomedes over this icon. But what you have now affected is childish and imperfect. You have painted a picture of a dead corpse. Okay, so what's going on here? John is, well, supposedly John, right, is chastising Lycomedes because this image just is dead. It's not a true reflection or representation or really reproduction of what St. John looks like. So you see actually some Platonic critiques here of art, because Plato famously held that we should not be fans of art because it deceptively imitates reality. And then this theme is picked up by other church fathers like St. Clement of Alexandria, who talks about stories in which, you know, there's one man who tried to have sex with a statue of Aphrodite. And he was saying, look at this madness that people are looking at these artistic works as if they are actually the reality that they are representing. So it's not just representation, it's also a deception. Now, whether or not you agree with that Platonic critique of art, that's, I think, a relevant discussion. But the point is that in a lot of people's minds, at least at this time, they had Platonic ideas about, you know, the critique of art, at least in the Christian circles that we're reading from, at least textually speaking. So that's something worth putting up front. Whether or not that's a good argument, I don't think it is, but it's worth noting that it's there. Going on then, Father Richard Price explains that this text, quote, is not an attack on idolatry, but distinguishes a man's external appearance and his true identity. So notice that there's a distinction apparently in the mind of the author of the Acts of John between external appearance and true identity. We get some Platonism here, which is what ultimately gets Acts of John in trouble. This is my commentary now. Nicaea II condemned it for denying the reality of Christ's flesh, glorifying his invisible nature over and above his visible form, which is a mere phantasm. To quote from the Acts of John, quote, "Sometimes when I meant to hold Jesus, I encountered a material and solid body. But at other times when I again touched him, the substance was immaterial and bodiless, as if wholly non-existent." And if you go down to the second footnote there, there's a part in the Acts of John where Jesus disappears and becomes just an unembodied voice. And John the Beloved supposedly says that this voice is truly of God. So now that Jesus is finally invisible and just a voice, now this is truly of God. But, when he's physically, bodily present, we're not so sure. To go on with my paragraph, the connection between preferring the invisible over the visible, thus barring images, and denying the reality of Christ's visible flesh is no coincidence. This is precisely why it was cited at Nicaea II, to the shame of the iconoclast bishops at Hieria, who had used this text against images and image veneration. So, ironically enough, this early second century source, or excuse me, this second half of the second century source reports to us that, okay, we have some people here who are condemning image veneration. But why are they condemning image veneration? Because they essentially have a heretical Christology and view of the relationship between the visible and invisible, the corporeal and incorporeal world. And in the process then of thinking that the invisible and the incorporeal is necessarily greater, or at least so great that it should be to the detriment of the visible and the corporeal, they end up saying that Christ, he didn't really have a body. And when he was outside of his body, that's when he was truly God. Okay, that's problematic, right? That's taking it too far. Not to deny that in the hierarchy of being, right, the angels are above us, but at least only for a time, right? Only for a time. Leaving that aside, the point I want to make here is that you have this heretical source on heretical Christological grounds, right, condemning images. This works exactly in the favor of Nicaea II, because Nicaea II was saying there is a non-accidental connection between heretical Christology and rejecting the veneration of images. And what case in point, Acts of John, which was cited by Hieria and the iconoclast bishops at Hieria. They tried to argue that actually Orthodox Christology leads to the rejection of the veneration of images. So this actually really did backfire big time on Hieria. Now, just to keep going, quote, although the Christology of the Acts of John is heretical, its value for us is that it indicates there were people like Lycomedes in the 2nd century. There's this general rule among scholars that if a source is condemning something, it's because enough people were doing it to come to that writer's attention such that they feel the need to condemn it. Having and venerating images. And perhaps Lycomedes was closer to the truth than the author of the Acts of John realized. If this is correct, then Nicaea II was not a U-turn or corruption, but truly a vindication of the lived religion of the people who from the very beginning of the faith saw there was a place for images and their cult. Okay, so there's the new evidence, right? We have confirmation from the end of the 2nd century that there were people who were venerating images. And let me say this. Okay, let's say Irenaeus hypothetically is against image veneration. Okay, so you have an Orthodox source that's against image veneration. Just hypothetically, I know some people don't want to concede that. Fair enough. I'm just saying hypothetically. And you have this heretical source with an explicitly heretical Christology condemning image veneration as well. Okay, so you have people who are Orthodox and people who are not Orthodox condemning the veneration of images. Somebody could say, oh, well, then that's double points, right, against image veneration. But it could also be the case that there's something actually to this practice, that it does go back quite early, and that we should not take one, like if we could view these sources as canceling each other out, right? And think to ourselves, well, what are the reasons for image veneration? Since we see that people with good reasons, like let's say maybe Irenaeus is an Orthodox source, and bad reasons, this heretical source, Acts of John, are critiquing image veneration. We should maybe look not just at what the sources say, but what the reasons are for image veneration. In other words, I don't think that this debate can entirely be settled just on the attitude of, let's say, Irenaeus alone, right? When Irenaeus doesn't necessarily go into all of his reasoning, but we have the reasoning of another source rejecting image veneration, and it's heretical, right? So that should give us pause then. We shouldn't think that the Acts of John has a valid argument here or contribution. So just to conclude this first part of the presentation, St. Irenaeus and the Acts of John show that icon veneration was practiced as early as the second half of the 2nd century. Now, this is not to say one way or the other that icon veneration was widely embraced or not. But it is to note, right, that it was around. Some aniconism among early Christians, if we can call them that, was rooted in heretical Christological beliefs, case in point, Acts of John. And you could sense maybe in Irenaeus, right, an anti-pagan pagan polemic. Okay, maybe we can concede that. But somebody might say, okay, Suan, this is all really nice that you found this late 2nd century evidence, but it doesn't show that the apostles were venerating icons. So at worst, or maybe at best, actually, this was an early accretion into Christianity, but it wasn't something that the apostles were doing themselves. Hence, we need to get into my other essay, Does Nicaea II Allow for Development? Sorry, I didn't mean to get a southern twang there. So the first thing to note about the debate on Nicaea II is that you're going to probably go to me or Gavin Ortland or Seraphin Hamilton or anybody else to give you the summary of what Nicaea II is saying. The problem with that is that we're giving you a summary. The Acts themselves are 796 pages. That is, of course, including Father Price's commentary and essential footnotes. But leaving that aside, the Acts, regardless, are hundreds of pages. And so when you are hearing somebody summarize the evidence for you, you know, you have to be careful, right, to some extent, because they are only presenting you as much as they are presenting you in a source that is hundreds of pages. You want to be careful if somebody is taking shortcuts, if somebody's not giving you the whole story, or in fact, even we as exegetes who have hopefully read the entire council, hopefully we are not missing anything or leaving any stones unturned. And so in my first essay in response to Gavin Ortland on whether Nicaea II allows for development, I have 3 exegetical principles that I use and show in the text, in the essay, my application of. So first, the principle of controversy. If the immediate context of a passage does not adequately resolve interpretive disputes, then consult the rest of the text beyond the immediate context. This is a pretty intuitive principle. It's a variation of the Protestant idea somewhat that, and I don't even think this needs to be necessarily a Protestant idea, but that you interpret less clear passages in the Bible in light of more clear passages in the Bible. That if you see something you don't understand, back up and read the whole context, right? Or read another part of the text. Or if you see people, disagreeing on a certain interpretation of a passage, you shouldn't maybe just stay stuck in that immediate local passage. So I apply that principle in my essay. And then this is another principle that I think intuitively follows, which is the principle of totality, right? Interpret each part of a text in light of the whole. I know Gavin Ortland would certainly endorse this principle in the case of slavery in the Bible, that he would want us to look at not just the individual passage in isolation, but the whole arc of Scripture, the whole narrative arc of Scripture, as he would say. Fair enough. So let's apply that principle to the Acts of Nicaea II. The third principle is the principle of rhetoric. Identify why and how rhetorical flourishes are being used in the text. Now, by rhetoric, I just mean like language that's meant to communicate and convince somebody or persuade somebody. And so sometimes you'll see, people using very bombastic and triumphalist language to convince someone or to cover up certain things. So I use this example quite often. Suppose that your friend comes up to you, fellow guys, and he says, I was talking to this girl, and she was so into me, and she was so happy to talk to me, and I had so much game. Okay, cool. And then somebody asks him, but did you get her number? And he says, no, very quietly. Well, all of that stuff before was a rhetorical flourish to protect his wounded ego and to make it seem as if he had done a really great job dancing around the fact that he didn't get her number. And so then that casts kind of everything else in a different light. My point here is that Nicaea II has rhetorical flourishes. It speaks with bombastic and triumphalist language, but if you start digging deeper underneath what's going on, you see a much more careful and precise argument. And so let me get into now showing you how these principles apply in this debate. So Gavin Ortland focuses on a particular passage in the Second Council of Nicaea. This is in session 7. Let me quote the line in session 7, which is the last definitive session. This is after the ruling and the decision of the council. And it says, quote, In their honor, that is the honor of the saints and Mary and Jesus Christ, an offering of incensation and lights is to be made in accordance with the pious custom of the men of old. For the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerates in it the hypostasis of the one who is represented. Okay, so what's going on in this passage? Why is Gavin using it in his favor? Well, Gavin basically views this passage as evidence for the view that they are claiming incensation and lights, that is, burning incense and lighting a candle in front of images, is a pious custom of the men of old, aka it's an apostolic tradition. And so he claims that this is what Nicaea II is claiming. Here is an instance in which Nicaea II is directly defining what the apostles were doing with images. So just to quote here, my paragraph and parts of what Gavin says, Ortlund has more citations, however. He mentions the practices of, quote, prostration and bowing before images, as well as lighting candles and incense as an offering in there, that is the image's honor, end quote, which Nicaea II allegedly considers continuing Gavin's citation of Nicaea II, the pious custom of the men of old. So just to be clear, he is claiming on page 213 of his book, What It Means to Be Protestant, that Nicaea II is saying the pious custom of the men of old is the incensation and burning of candles, right? That is what is being said here, is the pious custom of the men of old. He then claims that, quote, Gavin now, in maintaining this custom, the bishops insisted that we follow Paul, this is quoting Nicaea II, who spoke in Christ and the whole company, divine company of the apostles, end quote. So Ortlund ultimately stresses that Nicaea II's case against the iconoclast is premised upon the strict and wholesale preservation of tradition, and he cites the anathemas of Nicaea II. Okay, I'm going to show you that this actually is not the correct interpretation of what Nicaea II is saying. So let me first show that there are some questions here on, is a pious custom of the men of old necessarily an apostolic tradition? Because Nicaea II elsewhere says that, for example, the reproduction of in images is an apostolic tradition. It has no problem explicitly saying if something is an apostolic tradition. But why does it use the language of pious custom of the men of old? That seems to say it's a very old tradition, doesn't necessarily say it's an apostolic tradition. And so I'm just interested in what's going on in this passage. And so we should then, in light of the principle of controversy, the fact that there are some questions here, look at the rest of the text of Nicaea II. And so let's apply the principle of totality. So fortunately, Nicaea II does elsewhere explain what is a pious custom. And so in the sixth session, the veneration principle, that is the idea that the honor given to an image goes to the one represented, is identified as a pious custom and apostolic tradition. Okay, so pious custom and apostolic tradition, based on the sixth session of the council, are basically interchangeable. And they cite St. Basil, St. Athanasius, and Pseudo-Chrysostom as evidence for the veneration principle being an apostolic tradition, because the basic idea around the time of Nicaea II was that if you had the citations from the Golden Age church fathers, that is the church fathers around the time of Nicaea, then that was basically a guarantee that that was an apostolic tradition. That's how highly these Golden Age fathers were viewed. And remember, whether or not you agree with that assessment, that's a separate question. I'm just saying, if we're just on the question of interpreting Nicaea II on its own terms, those are the terms of Nicaea II. Okay, so at first glance, this conclusion might vindicate Ortlund, as I agree that pious custom is another way of saying apostolic tradition. However, the very sentence following the pious custom of the men of old in the seventh session says, for the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype, and whoever venerates the image venerates in it the hypostasis of the one who is represented. Hold on. As I previously demonstrated, the sixth session identifies the pious custom as the veneration principle. One is therefore justified to think that the same holds true in the seventh session. Burning incense and candles is, quote, in accordance with the pious custom of the men of old, end quote. And this pious custom is the veneration principle. It's not itself incensation and lighting candles. This interpretation explains why the council repeats the veneration principle in the next sentence in the seventh session. So right after it says that incensation and lighting candles is in accordance, not necessarily that it is, but that it's in accordance with the pious custom of the men of old, Nicaea II, assuming that you've read the rest of the council, repeats what that pious custom is, which is the veneration principle. So that's what I said once again. So once more, Ortlund has not produced decisive proof that the council attributed any specific veneration practices back to the apostles. I want to emphasize here once again that this is so important in this conversation, because if we aren't reading Nicaea II properly and we just read the seventh session in isolation, then we can come to these conclusions that, oh yeah, it's claiming that this is what the apostles were doing. Admittedly, when I first read the seventh session, after looking at what Gavin had said, I thought, okay, no, he's got something here. And then when I started reading the rest of the council to see where they define what a pious custom is, this is literally an instance where if you read the whole council, if you apply the principle of totality, it actually does make a difference in this debate. So I want to stress how serious of a blunder this is on Gavin's part, but also how critical it is to read the entire writings of the council that we are debating and looking at. You can't just read the seventh session and think that's the end of the day. And even if Gavin did read the rest of the council, you have to be a careful reader. You have to be meticulous and cite and check everything. And so once again, 700 something pages in this book. It's a lot to go through. I went through it and I'm trying my best to show you, here's the evidence. Let's look at it in its totality. So when it comes to then the principle of rhetoric, here's my thesis on what Nicaea II says about apostolic icon veneration. Nicaea II remains silent on or stepped around the question of apostolic icon veneration for two reasons. One, they had no definitive evidence that the apostles themselves venerated images. I looked at every single source that Nicaea II cited in its favor, and not one of them, whether explicitly or implicitly, can be used to substantiate the claim that the apostles were venerating images. That is not to say that Nicaea II doesn't have arguments in favor of venerating images, but that it doesn't make this argument that, oh, we venerate the images because the apostles were venerating the images in the exact same way that we are now. The claim is not that 8th century veneration practices are valid because the apostles were doing the exact same. They could have made that argument. No, the argument is much more subtle than that. The argument is, if we are allowed to venerate saints and the honor given to an image goes to the one represented, put the two together, and so long as a practice is veneration, we can apply to images. You just need those two things to come together. The second thing I want to mention too is that Nicaea II did not wish to unnecessarily make their case appear weaker amidst the iconoclast controversy. So as I said before, with like the example of your friend coming up to you and telling you that he had talked to this girl and he uses triumphalist, bombastic language, but he covers up the fact that he didn't actually get her number. I'm saying that Nicaea II doesn't want to make themselves look unnecessarily weak, it doesn't want to take, it doesn't want to sabotage itself or make itself look weak in that way. Nicaea II technically doesn't need that proof for the argument to still be valid. They don't need the apostles to have been bowing, kissing, and praying to images for the argument to be valid that they have presented so far. But the fact that they don't have that evidence, they don't feel the need to bring that up, right? Just as your friend, he might be a little misleading by not telling you all the details. Now, I'm not saying Nicaea II is misleading. Why is that? Because Nicaea II actually tells you its argument. And if you read and pay attention between the lines, you see what it's saying. And so if you misunderstand what Nicaea II is saying because of its triumphalist language, because of its anathemas, the issue is that kind of like a bull seeing red, you just see the anathemas and then you think, oh, there's no nuance here. There's no precision, no carefulness. No. You're not reading the council carefully. The council gets to its anathemas and I would say it earns its triumphalist language of saying it preserves the traditions of the apostles. Now, let me get into that in more detail here, because the Nicaea II I have no problem saying that Nicaea II wholesale preserved the traditions of the apostles, because the next question to ask is, what did Nicaea II claim is the tradition of the apostles? And when you look at those traditions, none of them falsify my thesis. And so, of course, I have no problem then saying Nicaea II wholesale preserved the apostolic traditions that it received. Moving on then. It is important to emphasize that the horos of Nicaea II, quote, does not define doctrine, but lays down practice, according to Father Price. And I think that's right. And hence, although horos in a conciliar context is usually translated definition, decree is most appropriate here. And Richard Price mentions this in his essay on the Second Council of Nicaea, the defense of images at the Second Council of Nicaea. So it's important to know what Father Price is saying here. He's not saying that they defined exactly what the apostles were doing. Rather, it definitively laid down the practice of the church. And hence, although horos is usually translated as definition, here it's decree, right? And let's look at what the horos actually says. But before we get there, right, Father Price does say that he thinks that the horos, that some commentators, quote, have found the horos to be a thin and disappointing document. For what it formally lays down is not a particular doctrine about images, but simply that images are to be set up and receive veneration. We may detect behind this the cautious sobriety of Patriarch Tarasios of Constantinople, eager to minimize the grounds for subsequent contention. Two things here. First, notice that the horos, the definitive ruling of the council, is a thin and disappointing document. It's not this robust and detailed document that's telling you what the apostles were doing in the first century. It just lays down practice, not a particular, here's what the apostles were doing, so on and so forth. Secondarily, notice that the way that the document is worded, or the horos is worded to minimize the grounds for subsequent contention. When I read Gavin and some other Protestant commentators, I get the impression that they think Nicaea II was just this sloppy, arrogant document that was overstepping the evidential resources that it has. But then Tarasios here, in the way that, you know, the horos is written out, seems to actually be very precise and careful and not showing just this kind of sloppiness. And so I want to say here, okay, let's kind of be a bit more charitable to Nicaea II, actually read it, just as in the case of, if you just read the seventh session, you might think that the pious custom of the men of old is in sensation, the lighting of candles, as Gavin did. When we start reading between the lines, and as scholars reading past the rhetoric, we see, okay, wait, they're being a bit more cautious here, even though they are being very triumphalistic elsewhere. So here's what the horos says. We therefore decree with all care and precision that venerable and holy images made in colors or mosaic or other fitting materials in the same was as the figure of the honorable and life-giving cross are to be dedicated in the holy churches of God, or on sacred vessels and vestments, on walls and panels, in houses and in the streets, namely the image of our Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ, of our Immaculate Lady, the Theotokos, Lady, the Holy Theotokos, and of the honorable angels and all the holy and sacred men. One thing I want to note is that from what I recall, Gavin has never cited or mentioned the horos, the decree of Nicaea II, which is strange because it's the definitive ruling of the council. It's like if you're going to mention a Supreme Court ruling and you don't mention the actual part of the ruling where it says, here's our decision. This is a key part of the passage that is said to be given with all care and precision. And so we should, if we're going to be charitable to Nicaea II, show that same corresponding respect to read what it is ruling and decreeing. Now, when it comes to the principle of rhetoric, once again, I had an email correspondence with Father Richard Price because there was one passage that made me a bit nervous. Let me get into what I mean here. So Father Price says this in that same essay I cited previously. Apart, however, from a letter attributed to St. Basil the Great, but manifestly a later concoction, that is pseudo-Basil Epistle 360, no passage from this period, that is the 4th and 5th centuries, was produced that expressed approval of the actual veneration of images. as distinct from using them as an aid to reflection and stimulus to prayer. So you could actually end the debate right here, because if I can show that St. Basil the Great, or the pseudo Basil source, Epistle 360, does not even claim that the apostles were venerating images, that's not how even that forgery argues to its conclusion. And none of the other sources that they cited, the Council Fathers of Nicaea II from the 4th and 5th centuries, say anything similar, then there's no reason to think that Nicaea II has that as a premise in its argument, that the apostles were bowing, kissing, praying, so on and so forth to images, and that's why we do it now in the 8th century. So fortunately, we could theoretically end the debate there, because pseudo-Basil doesn't claim that the apostles were venerating images. Now, there's a reason why I emailed Father Price, and it's because he translated the same epistle from pseudo-Basil differently, and I wanted to know why that was the case, because there is actually a relevant difference. So let me cite the first translation that Father Price gives. Quote, "I therefore also honor and venerate the figures of their images, especially because this was handed down from the holy apostles and was not forbidden by them, but these are portrayed in all our churches." So the first "this" sounds as if it is corresponding to honoring and venerating the figures of the images. In other words, what was handed down from the apostles? The veneration of the images. But that "but" there actually indicates, but these are portrayed in all our churches, that the emphasis is not the honoring and venerating the figures of the images, but it's the images themselves that were handed down from the holy apostles, not forbidden by them. But these images are portrayed in all of our churches. So that final "but" there really does make a difference. Now, if you have an "and" rather than a "but" there, if you have a "kai," that is an "and" rather than an "Allah," "but" in Greek, then that does make a difference, because then you could take the reading, okay, the first "this" is referring to honoring and venerating images, supposedly handed down from the apostles, not forbidden by them, and just on top of that, images are portrayed in all of our churches, right? So I asked Father Price, is there a reason why he translated things differently? And he admitted that the second time around, that their "but" was used again, but he just used the word "and." And I asked Father Price, could you make the argument that the thing that is not forbidden, the thing that is handed down, are the images, since those are the things portrayed in churches? And so that "but" there has this adversarial role of kind of specifying what came before, right? So what was handed down? What was not forbidden by them? The portrayal of images in the churches, or rather the images themselves. Hence, but these are portrayed in all our churches. And fortunately, if you go to the Greek, it actually bears out this translation. So I have the Greek on the screen, and now I have my translation, and I'll just read it out. "Therefore, I also honor and bow before the characteristics of their images, especially in accordance with those ones that have been handed down from the holy apostles and have not been forbidden, but in all our churches these ones are represented." So I use the Greek there to show that the emphasis is not that honoring and bowing down before images is what was handed down by the apostles, according to pseudo-Basil, Epistle 360. No, what pseudo-Basil is saying is what was handed down were the images, and these weren't forbidden by the apostles, and in fact, they're up in all our churches. I should also say here that the translation I'm giving here is not just Suan Sonna's translation. It's backed by Roy J. de Ferrari and other translations of this relevant passage. So I think I was able to get Father Price to see my translation. I don't know if he fully has changed his mind, but he said, yeah, you could translate the last Allah, the last "but" in that adversarial sense and get to your translation, where the "but" is contradicting the idea that the apostles had forbidden images, rather they were handed down from the apostles. So if that's the case, right, then that shuts another door for Ortland's interpretation that Nicaea II doesn't allow for development. Because Nicaea II doesn't say one way or the other what the apostles were doing. Now, here's the last kind of icing on the cake. I look into the claims of Nicaea II on what were apostolic traditions, and I list them out. So here they are. Declaring one's faith upon priestly ordination. The veneration of saints is claimed to be apostolic tradition. Of course, the veneration principle, the Trinity and the Incarnation, duh. The making and having of images, that's explicitly stated in Pope Hadrian's letter and is repeated in the seventh session once again. The use of images in the cult of the saints, because of the unanimous attestation of the sources that Nicaea II used that images have some place in the cult of saints, that seems to be the impression of the council, is that they do think that is certainly apostolic in nature. And I think Pope Hadrian's letter says the same thing. The presence of images in churches is considered apostolic, right? Because take Pseudo-Basil Epistle 360, if the council did take that as an authoritative source, what does that source say? Images can be in churches, and images were made from the beginning. And the refusal to apply Exodus 20 verses 4-5 against Christian images. If you're Protestant, that is the second commandment. If you're Catholic, that's the first commandment. And the belief in general in the good use of images. So obviously some of these traditions were not distinctly separated by the Council Fathers. It's not like they made this explicit list. Some of them, of course, are wrapped together. But what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of conceptually making the distinctions here, conceptually separating them out so you can see what Nicaea II claimed were apostolic in origin. So with that, then, I am totally willing to admit that Nicaea II preserved all the apostolic traditions that it claims it received. And here they are. One of them is not that the apostles were kissing, praying, so on and so forth to images. That's not how the apostles justified veneration or image honoring practices. That's not how the council did so either. And there you have, once again, right, my conclusion here. All you need to get to Nicaea II is that you can venerate saints, and you can venerate saints through their images, aka the veneration principle. If you just have those two things, then that's enough to get to the conclusion of Nicaea II. And thus, if you are actually further insisting, whether you are Eastern Orthodox or Gavin Ortland, if you are further insisting that Nicaea II needs to establish that the apostles were kissing, bowing, praying to images to justify that practice in the 8th century, you have to justify why Nicaea II needs to do that when on Nicaea II's own terms, what I've given there is enough to get to its conclusion, right? Why does Nicaea II have to go further than what's enough? So I'm just kind of pressing the burden there on why does it have to go further? I'm not saying that Nicaea II is saying the apostles would have rejected image veneration. I'm saying they danced around that question and stayed quiet because they didn't need to make that argument. Because if you have the veneration of saints and the veneration principle, you get Nicaea II. Why do they need to go further? Now I can turn the tables in that way. The second thing I focus on in the second essay, what I focus on in the second essay is whether Nicaea II is a valid development. And I want to first summarize what Ortland's case is against Nicaea II, because he actually is making distinct claims or arguments here. There are three basic contentions to Ortland's case. The first is what I call the no precedent contention, where basically image veneration practices lack sufficient historical support to such a degree that Catholics and Eastern Orthodox cannot defend Nicaea II as a development. How does Ortland do this? He uses what I call a lowest common denominator reading. So if you remember in Ortland's viral 75-minute video, where he goes through, I think, 12 or so historical sources on images and image veneration, he looks at it from the angle of, at minimum, do these sources endorse everything that Nicaea II taught, or at least even maybe the essentials of what Nicaea II taught? And because he goes with his lowest common denominator, he finds no evidence, right? What do they all converge on? Well, they seem to be kind of standoffish. They're very cautious around images. They don't have this full-fledged support that Nicaea II does. And so I'm going to take this lowest common denominator reading. On the other hand, in my presentation video in response to Gavin Ortland, I think it was called Icons and Doctrinal Development, I show that if you apply a different angle or perspective on the evidence, you can actually see that there is a development from somebody like Tertullian saying that images were originally from the devil, all the way, and are just inherently idolatrous, or at least complicit with idolatry, all the way to Pope Gregory the Great, where Pope Gregory seems to say, no, images can be in churches and they have a valid didactic purpose. there's a development there. But because Gavin is going with this lowest common denominator reading, you almost kind of miss that there is a development from Tertullian to Pope St. Gregory the Great. So that's one argument. The second argument is what I call the no recognition point, where basically Nicaea II's teachings on image veneration would have been rejected by early Christians had they heard it. Gavin does say explicitly somewhere in his book, like, had any Christian in the first 5 centuries heard about Nicaea II, who would seriously say that they wouldn't have rejected it. He says something along those lines. Now, I want to say here that the no recognition point is much stronger than the no precedent point. And so Gavin can't switch between the two if he's pressed on, let's say, the no recognition point, because the no recognition contention concerns how each of the individual sources would have responded to Nicaea II in the negative on Ortland's view. Whereas the no precedent conclusion is based on the lowest common denominator that all of his sources seem to share. The no recognition claim is much more evidentially demanding than the no precedent claim. If Ortland is pressed on the no recognition point, he cannot responsibly switch to the no precedent claim. They are truly distinct. So, for example, if I can show you a source in the first 4 centuries of the church, which seems to actually positively talk about images, and it's not clear, right, whether or not it would have rejected Nicaea II, then that would actually cast severe doubt on this no recognition contention. Or at least it would say, Gavin, you need to really tone down your rhetoric because this is overstepping the evidence of the first centuries of the church. And the third claim, of course, is that he believes is the non-apostolic origins claim, that image veneration is not apostolic in origin. And so he says here that the practice of venerating icons does not date back to the apostles or anywhere remotely close to them. And here I do want to say that I should have done this in the beginning. The word veneration really needs to be defined, because in one sense, veneration can just mean image honoring in the broadest, most general, most all-encompassing sense. But veneration can specifically mean proskuneo, bowing, prostrating. It can also mean, very specifically in Gavin's mind, kissing, incensing, lighting candles to images, praying through an image, so on and so forth. So we have all these different languages, these ideas about what veneration means. And at least in the eyes of Nicaea II, they understood veneration as meaning, those practices, because those were the practices under attack by the iconoclasts. But if you go to, for example, their citation of Leontos of Neapolis, who unfortunately has a work titled Against the Jews, in that work, Leontios defends image veneration. But when he talks about image veneration, he considers even crying over the shawl of your dead loved one as veneration. And so Nicaea II doesn't have this artificially precise, particularly Protestant Gavin Ortland definition of veneration. Okay, so we have to be careful here when we define veneration. And I think what Gavin means here is maybe a very broad sense of veneration, but leaving that to one side, we just need to be careful when we're defining our terms. And so for the sake of this argument, for the sake of this debate, I'm going to say, let's go with Gavin's understanding of what he particularly means by veneration. And what he means by veneration are particularly image-honoring practices that he finds problematic. Okay, so now to my essay on Nicaea II as a valid development. I give 3 points. The first is representativeness, where I provide key pieces of evidence that complicate Ortland's characterization of early Christian art history. And I basically just show that, the no precedent claim that he's making is really skewed. The no recognition claim, you can make arguments actually that there are some Christians who probably would have approved of Nicaea II. And these aren't lightweights. These are pretty heavy characters. The second point is on scripture, particularly the apostles, ancient Judaism, and ancient Israel. And I provide evidence from ancient Judaism and ancient Israel for the place of images. I try to show that the old Protestant view that pious ancient Jews were totally opposed to images is really a myth. It's a Protestant myth. And then the third thing I look at is Ortland's sources, and I evaluate each of them for their evidential weight and relevance. And I'll get into, all that. I won't tell you what the conclusions I come to every single one of his sources, but I'll give you the general rules that I used when I was applying and assessing his evidence. So Father Price notes in his commentary on Nicaea II that it was a big deal that, for example, Nicaea II was able to cite John Chrysostom in its favor. Quote, had not John Chrysostom referred with approval to the popularity of images of the recently deceased Meletius of Antioch. This is significant because Nicaea II and Hieria both considered these Golden Age church fathers to be authoritative witnesses. Essentially, like if one of them says it or if all of them say it, it goes back to the apostles, whatever that something is. And the fact that Nicaea II had this source from John Chrysostom in its favor is significant. It would have scored significant points against the iconoclast bishops at Hieria. And let me quote actually John Chrysostom now on his homily on Saint Meletius of Antioch. What happened was a lesson in devotion. Notice he's saying this is a good thing. This is a lesson in devotion. Emulate this. Now getting back to his comments on the Christians of Antioch. For led continually, as they were, to remember that name and to keep that saint in mind, they used the name to banish all irrational emotion and thought. And just to pause here really quick, in the ancient world, names actually did carry significant power. We have evidence from Jewish exorcist incantation bowls and other sources that they used the name of Jesus, for example, because it apparently had a powerful effect on exorcising demons. So the name is a powerful thing. And this became so frequent that everywhere in the districts, the marketplace, the fields, and the streets, his name, Meletius's, re-echoed from all sides. You have been affected not so much by the name on its own as by the very form of his body. For what you did with names, this you have done with images as well. For many cups have impressed that holy image on rings on the finger, on cups and bowls, on the walls of rooms, and indeed everywhere, so as not only to hear that holy name, but also to see the form of his body everywhere and have a twofold consolation of his departure. So nice. John Chrysostom has a really high view of what the Antiochian Christians were doing with Meletius's image. Would he have opposed Nicaea II? At worst, I'd say, I don't know. Best case scenario, I would say he'd give it a big thumbs up based on what he's saying here. So this idea that Gavin is saying, oh, all these Christians in the first 500 years of the church would have rejected Nicaea II, I'm not really sure about that. That seems to be a very big oversell. And, you know, some people might approach my claim here that you can have evidence from ancient Judaism and ancient Israel for images with a lot of skepticism, because we have this idea in our minds, and certainly I had this when I was Protestant, that, yeah, ancient Jews were just so opposed to images. And if they allowed images, these were like the impious and, you know, I don't know, cultural, lackluster, you know, people. These weren't the really good, devout ones. That's so artificial and that's so unfair. So to quote from my essay again, another problem I will mention here is that Ortlund says far too little about the apostles in ancient Judaism. A defender of Nicaea II can capitalize on this gap at the beginning of Ortlund's presentation by providing evidence for a cult of images, a cult of saints, and the fusion of the two by or in first century Palestinian Judaism. Insofar as this case is successful, it can undercut Ortlund's by vindicating Nicaea II as a continuation of the apostolic heritage. And so all the early Christian suspicion, notably among Gentile philosophers, Gentile apologists, that was a speed bump, a temporary block in a development, or it could be viewed as part of the development, but they were going further than even what the ancient Jews thought about images. And so this idea that these early Christians who are attacking images are really continuing the apostolic Jewish heritage, that can be called into severe question. And if you have any, you know, and if this case is met with immediate skepticism by Ortlund, Joss Elsner in the T&T Clark Handbook of the Early Church notes that, quote, in the case of ancient Christian art, the excessive Protestantism which determined the pure faith of both late ancient Judaism and early Christianity to have been aniconic, probably anti-iconic, even iconoclastic, before the 3rd century AD has been rightly corrected. So one is that Ortland's rhetoric, Ortland's presentation of the evidence, it's reviving old Protestant tropes that have been debunked by recent scholarship or corrected and called into serious question. Even some of the sources that Ortland is saying are using from scholars, that has shifted. And I remember I was sitting down with a professor, an associate professor at Harvard in classics, who's an expert in Byzantine literature. And I was sitting down with this professor, and he told me, there's a lot of open questions in the field right now. The field is shifting quite a bit, actually. And so this idea, I mean, there are, let's say, points of agreement insofar as we can tell. There seem to be here and there points of unanimity, but there are also things that are changing vastly, and you have to keep up with the literature. And so I should mention, too, that Elsner is of the opinion, however, that, quote, the current consensus on the enthusiasm of early Christians for art is probably also excessive, end quote. So leaving aside whether you agree with Elsner, notice what he's saying. That is the current consensus as of 2022, that there was actually an enthusiasm of early Christians for art. And he thinks it's excessive, okay? So this is not Roman Catholic Suan over here saying, oh, there's actually maybe more evidence for a favorable view of images in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. That's the current consensus. And Elsner saying, I'm worried that they're taking it too far. Now, once again, as I said, either whether you agree with that or not, that's a separate question. But the fact is, that is the current consensus. And to give you evidence from ancient Judaism, I want to show you a passage from 1 Maccabees chapter 13, which the latest commentary, which is done by Daniel Schwartz, dates 1 Maccabees to around 110 BC. So it reports that Simon Maccabeus, brother of Judas Maccabeus, buried his deceased family members in tombs with grand monuments he commissioned during the early days of his reign over Judea. The monument to the monument for his father and brothers was, quote, high so that it might be seen with polished stone at the front and back, 1 Maccabees 13:27. And for these same men, but including this time his mother, Simon, quote, erected 7 pyramids opposite one another, surrounded by great columns. And on the columns he put, or in the Hebrew, Schwartz argues, you can say depicts, suits of armor for a permanent memorial. And beside the suits of armor, he carved ships so that they could be seen by all who sail the sea. So all of a sudden, you have 160s, right, when the Maccabean revolt happens, 160s BC, an explosion of images in ancient Judea, because Simon Maccabeus is building all these monuments. He carves an image of the ship, and he also depicts, or maybe he just puts up, Schwartz argues for depicts, suits of armor. So another image potentially. And the point here is that, okay, why did this happen? Why do we see all of a sudden this explosion of images? Well, it's interesting because remember, the Maccabees and the Jewish people of this time were fighting the Seleucid Empire in order to regain national sovereignty, in order to make Israel, once again, a state for the Jewish people to freely, safely practice the Torah. When they get that, then they allow for images. And so there seems to be this principle that once there is the sovereignty of the nation and the protection of the cult from pagan influences, then you can allow images, because images now won't have this corrupting effect, but can actually have this good celebratory effect. When was the last time in ancient Israel's history when we see an explosion of images? The Solomonic Temple. And what happened during the time of the Solomonic Temple? You had King David defeating the enemies of Israel, establishing a kingdom, establishing a house for God, and God, falling in love with what his king wanting to do for him. And you have the king as the head of not only the government, but also the head of the temple, right? The king has this priestly role and this governmental role. In ancient Israel, the distinction between church and state is an artificial distinction. They're one in the same. The house of the king, the temple, is also the house of God. And you see even in Psalm 45, the king is called God, right? The cult of God and the cult of the king start getting melded together. That's a conversation for another time, but I do get into that in the essay in great detail. The point I'm trying to make here is that when the Jewish people finally have security, Then they allow images in. Then you start seeing images in the archaeological record. I wonder if I get into, let's see here. No, okay. So I'll mention King Hezekiah, who's supposedly this great iconoclast because he destroys the bronze serpent Nehushtan. When you go to the archaeological record, you see that King Hezekiah's seal has the winged sun and the Ankh on it. And when you go to the seal of his royal steward, Eliakim on his seal has two does. But I thought Exodus said that you can't have images of anything that crawls on the earth, under the earth, or is above. But here they are having images, and supposedly this iconoclast king, King Hezekiah, has images outside of the temple, images that aren't necessarily or directly divinely commissioned, showing that even the ancient Israelites, and then even here with First Maccabees, the ancient Jewish people, the Maccabees who were precisely pious and trying to preserve the Torah, they didn't think that Exodus meant they couldn't ever have images unless they were divinely commissioned. They didn't take it that far. And I want to say there's a great paper by Joseph Gutman, which talks about the second commandment. And Gutman basically says that the reason why you see the rules on against images in Exodus eventually laxed by the time you get to King David, because if you strictly interpreted the rules in Exodus on a textualist basis, then Exodus would rule out the Solomonic temple in principle. But the fact that you see this change happen, what made the difference? Gutman argues that the reason why God gave the commandment against images while Israel was still in the desert was because they were vulnerable to the surrounding cultures, to the surrounding, if I can call them pagans, and the cult couldn't be really secured. You had a tent and it would be put up for a while, then you move on. But you could easily intermarry, mingle in, you'd have to move all the time. You couldn't protect the cult. But once the cult is secured with King David, and then under the Maccabees, under the Hasmonean dynasty, you can have images again. In fact, it's interesting that the temple has images in it, the most holy place on earth where God is dwelling with his people. The image, which is the earthly temple, which is an imitation, a representation of the heavenly temple. The designs came to King David directly from God. Images are not problematic because they're profane. Images are actually so holy that in the most holy place on earth, the temple, God allowed there to be images. God wanted there to be images. It shows you that God doesn't have a low view of art or of images. He has such a high view of art that he wants it in his temple, in the very dwelling place and center of the religion. So this shows you then that actually, I think if we have these Protestant assumptions going in, we have such a skewed view of images and how the ancient Jews related to images. And I just wanted to show for fun the oldest depiction that we have of the human form in ancient Jewish art. This is an ostracon. It is like a piece of pottery showing apparently an image of Moses, and the serpent, his staff is changing midway into the serpent. And scholars date this image to about 81 to 117 AD. So either it's in the 1st century or the very early part of the 2nd century. And remember, what we have in the record is not the full archaeological witness. There are certainly things that didn't survive in history, but the fact that you see an ancient Jewish person drawing an image of Moses, that's pretty significant. Who knows, there are probably others out there. And on top of that, I mean, we do have images in 1st century synagogues, like the Magdala synagogue. I mean, hypothetically, St. Mary Magdalene, perhaps that was her synagogue growing up as a young Jewish girl. We have images in the 1st century. We have images very early on. So the images, though, in that synagogue are more, I think, vases, menorahs, and I'm trying to think about what else, but those are like the main kinds of images in that one. Okay, so now let me get into Ortlund's sources. Here's the thing: as Catholics, right, we don't proof text. Okay, let me back up. Protestants are very familiar with proof texting the Bible, right? Come up with a bunch of scriptural quotations, and that kind of is enough to end the conversation. But as Catholics, we don't view the church fathers as equal to sacred scripture unless in those cases where the contents of their writings, so not Chrysostom himself, not St. Basil himself, but the contents of what Basil is saying. Like if Basil says this is an apostolic tradition, okay, then that line is going to be very important for us. The contents of that passage are giving us the other mode or channel of divine revelation, which is sacred tradition. So, but at the same time, though, we don't just bow down to whatever historical source says. It's not game over if you can string a bunch of quotes together, right? We assess the authority of each source to see how relevant it is to the conversation. And so I notice here that as Catholics, we have this skill where we can actually discern, or we're supposed to learn how to discern the authority of certain sources in history. For example, we have this idea of theological notes, where you're supposed to be able to, well, theologians at least, are supposed to be capable of looking at documents from the magisterium and assessing the level of teaching authority in that document. Is this ex cathedra? Is this a statement of the universal ordinary magisterium? Is this of divine and Catholic faith, or is it of divine faith, or is it of fides ecclesiastica, something like that? We can assess the authoritative weight of the sources. I want to say that we can do the same thing with Gavin's citations. So one thing that I want to do to just show why this is important in this conversation is the role that the incarnation plays in the debate on images. So let me quote what Gavin says in his icon veneration presentation. Quote, Octavius, that's the Christian in the dialogue. This is the text by Marcus Minucius Felix with a dialogue between Caecellus and Octavius going on. His response is basically to say that because God is invisible, just like Deuteronomy 4, like we'll talk about later, God is invisible, God is brighter than light, therefore we do not represent God in any way. Okay, so that's what Octavius, the Christian interlocutor in this conversation, is saying in this text from Marcus Minucius Felix. Then Gavin goes on to say, John of Damascus will later argue that the incarnation has somehow has changed something that was lost on all of the ante-Nicene Christians. Nobody had this thought of, oh, well, because of the incarnation, it's changed now. I want to say that the incarnation really does make a difference on the question of image veneration, and it really does make a difference on when you go back and look at some of these sources, because remember the Acts of John. The Acts of John has a heretical Christology, and therefore it uses that same heretical logic to bar images. And if you go into a historical source that is barring images, okay, fine, but why? That is the question. Why is it barring images? And then we can judge based on how good or how bad those reasons are. So, for example, let me give you this quote from Ortland on page 196 of his book, What It Means to Be Protestant. And this is me quoting Ortland. As Ortland notes, now quoting Ortland, early apologists like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, for example, ridiculed the pagan practice of making images to be invoked and revered. Whereas the true God, they insisted, was invisible and distinct from matter altogether as the creator and sustainer of all things. Okay, so we're ridiculing pagans because they make images of their gods when our God, the true God, is invisible. Hold on. Is Jesus Christ the true God and visible? When I look at this image of Jesus Christ, am I not looking at the true God, or a representation of the true God, rather? If I were to see Jesus Christ in the flesh, and I touch his hands and I feel the nail wounds and his side, his pierced side, would I not be touching God? Would I not be touching the true God? You see, when these early sources start saying things like, oh, the true God is invisible, and they use this to dunk on the pagans, okay, maybe that scored points on the pagans back in the day, but in light of our developments in Christology, this is kind of a problematic argument. And so I don't know why I have to treat a source that has potentially at times a problematic Christological argument with authority. Right? I don't know why I have to take that as being the end all be all of this conversation. Now, this is not to slander St. Justin Martyr, But it is to say, okay, just as Thomas Aquinas sometimes makes arguments that I wish were better, or I wish he says things that he didn't say, or didn't say things that he did say, the same I can say with St. Justin Martyr, with Athenagoras, with other church sources. Hey, this isn't really a good argument against images because it has problematic Christological implications. So here are the 7 rules that I want to give you for when you are presented with these string of citations, right? The first thing is that if a source changes in a more iconophile direction, then that should at least preclude confidently concluding that such a source would have opposed Nicaea II. This is to counteract the no recognition point of Ortland, right? So Eusebius of Caesarea is one such piece of evidence where, with the letter to Constantia, which Ortland cites, he seems very opposed to images of Jesus and the apostles, but particularly Jesus. When you go later into Eusebius and he's writing Life of Constantine, which is the last piece that he writes before he dies, and he writes after Constantine is dead, he says that the emperor was moved with divine love, with great love, to put up an image of the cross. It sounds like Eusebius doesn't think that images are ruled out by Exodus 20, verse 4, all images. It sounds like Eusebius kind of softened his position on images there. Second, the communication of idioms should make us hesitant to fully embrace sources that insist rather recklessly upon the invisibility of the true God while ignoring or failing to fully appreciate that Jesus Christ is the true God and visible. What is the communication of idioms? It's a doctrine primarily developed, if I recall, it was definitely at the Council of Ephesus, because it's how you get to the idea that because Jesus is God and Mary's the mother of Jesus, that Mary's the mother of God. The communication of idioms is this idea that what is predicated or said of the divine person may be said of Christ's human nature and vice versa. So, for example, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ is God, and Jesus died on the cross. God died on the cross. I can say that in a non-heretical way, so long as I'm understanding that it's the divine person, of course, through his human nature, or rather in his human nature that died, not in the divine nature. The divine nature cannot die. Similarly, the second half of the communication of idioms is that what is predicated of the human nature cannot be predicated of the divine nature, or vice versa. What this means is, for example, Jesus Christ's human nature is corporeal. I can't then say Jesus Christ's divine nature is corporeal, because what I predicated of the human nature is specific to the human nature, and that doesn't apply right automatically over to the divine nature. For example, Jesus's divine nature is invisible. Therefore, Jesus's human nature is invisible. No, I can't say that, right? The predications can happen between the divine personhood of Jesus and his divine person and his human nature. But you can't start mixing the natures together, right? Read the Tome of Leo. The Tome of Leo is a wonderful theological masterpiece. Also, the third thing you should pay attention to are the presence of theological opinions rather than the claim to be handing down apostolic tradition. That should make us more willing to challenge the intellectual merits of a source's opinion and the extent to which an opinion is particular to that source. So I go into examples of where, for example, Origen becomes more extreme than Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria actually has a pretty nuanced view of images, but Origen goes much further. In fact, I think this might be in the slide. And Gavin gets it totally wrong when he says that Clement of Alexandria was more extreme than Origen. No, it's the other way around when it comes to images. But look, if a source is giving its own philosophical arguments against images, it's not claiming to be citing an apostle or rather, it's not claiming to be citing apostolic tradition, then we can judge that opinion based on how good its arguments are. We don't have to just bow and submit to the opinions of a particular historical source. On top of that, I just think that this is the fourth rule, like the invisibility of God is a questionable justification for either ancient Christians to conclude that no images whatsoever can be made, or for us to think that such a source, would oppose all images. Let me break this down. So if they're arguing that, we can't have images of our deity because God's invisible, Okay, even if I granted that, I don't see why we couldn't have images of saints or of the Blessed Virgin Mary who do not have the invisible divine nature in the same way that God has it. Of course, they've been, there's theosis and deification, but that's different. Also, if a source is saying that you can have images of the invisible God, can you really conclude from that they would oppose all images necessarily, or just images that try to depict the invisible God? Now, of course, that gets into the question of Christology and what would they think about images of Jesus, and that then takes us to the second point that I mentioned earlier, but I won't redo that. Also, the pagan context of these sources should make us consider the extent to which a source fairly considered the possibility of good and Christian uses for images, or if they were overly pessimistic and cautious. I use this example in the paper of, for example, Gavin and I don't mention this in the paper, but Gavin is a Baptist who is not opposed to alcohol. I was raised in a Baptist home that was vehemently opposed to alcohol. Now, suppose that a family is opposed to alcohol, like some parents, because they had alcoholism in their family, abuse, big problems like that. And the kids grow up and they realize, actually, alcohol itself is not problematic. It's just you have to be careful and drink in moderation. They try to tell and explain that nuance point to the parents, and the parents, because of their trauma, are like, no, we have to not allow any alcohol. It's all bad. And they use these kind of convoluted arguments and citations from scripture that are out of context, so on and so forth. We would recognize that, okay, on the one hand, like the parents have a valid concern. Alcoholism is bad. Idolatry is bad. At the same time, though, they're going too far with their stance against alcohol. And I would say that some early Christians were going too far in their response to images because they had trauma from paganism or something like that. I don't want to just say it was like a mental health problem, and not to speak lowly of mental health issues, but just we seem to have entered into this context where, the early Christians were in the minority surrounded by pagan culture. They have their own trauma from the persecution that they have from pagans, from the ridicule that pagans have towards them. And so they don't allow images because they're overly pessimistic. They're reacting in a very extreme way to their environment. There's so many examples of this actually from history. The Synod of Elvira, which I go into the paper on, scholars seem to think that, Elvira is reversing a prior precedent where images were actually more permissible in that society, but because of pagan persecution preceding that synod in Spain, they suddenly started clamping down on images again because of what the pagans had done to Christians, and then also the fact that some Christians had apostatized. Okay, that might be more information than you wanted. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the pagan context is important because sometimes it leads people to coming to extreme conclusions and over-responding. And of course, I don't want to say that images are like alcohol, but it's just a comparison. Okay, so don't take it any further than it's just an analogy. I'm not saying that images are like alcohol. Okay, let me say that. Number 6, the relevant differences between pagan gods and saints, especially relevant for those sources that elsewhere endorse the veneration and intercession of saints. These should make us reconsider whether a source would have or could reasonably have opposed Nicaea II. Gavin, for example, cites St. Augustine's homily on Psalm 115. Now, I think what's going on in Psalm 115, well, let me just give you the context. Augustine is responding to pagan idolatrous practices, and he's using Psalm 115, especially verse 5, do they have ears and yet hear not? Do they have eyes and yet see not? To emphasize his case that, pagan idolatry is silly. But then he anticipates this objection from a pagan that, Christians, they worship their sacred art. And then he cites Psalm 115:5, which I just said, and he says, do we through them pray unto God? Now, in context, we're talking about the cult of divine images of the deity. And Augustine is saying we don't treat these images as if they are God in the same way that the pagans are. Remember, the way to understand Augustine is to look at his opponent and who he's responding to. It's the pagans who treat their images as if they are their gods. Augustine says we don't do that with our God and with our images. So this is a non sequitur. On top of that, Augustine elsewhere specifically defends the veneration of saints. Contra Faustum, I think it's book 20, chapter 21 or paragraph 21. I'm trying to remember properly. Augustine specifically defends the idea that the cult of saints is not the same as the cult of the pagan gods. He goes out of his way to do that. So then to go and make Augustine give an argument against the cult of the saints or use it as an argument against the cult of the saints, I think is just not fair to Augustine. When Augustine goes out of his way to defend the cult of the saints as being different from the pagan gods, and then you make an argument to effectively say that in Augustine's mind, he would have thought that the cult of saints or the cult of the images of the saints is the same as the cult of the images of the pagan gods. That's just not fair to Augustine. Augustine went out of his way to defend the difference between the two cults. Lastly, in sources where disapproval of images or a cult of images is expressed, but there's minimal explanation offered, our confidence in that source's thoughts towards Nicaea II must be tempered. So some of these sources seem to have negative impressions of images, but they never give a justification or reason. Not all of them, certainly. But like, I think Irenaeus's is a bit vague, right? On what exactly he means, like what's so bad about images. He does connect it to somehow being a pagan or a Gentile. But I think ideally as historians looking at this evidence, we would want more explanation on what's the reasoning, what's the justification. Because if St. Irenaeus, doctor of the church, had given that reasoning and explanation, then we could assess the probability and the reasonableness of his conclusions. Or he could even help specify, oh, I'm arguing against pagan images, not images of the saints, right? These are things that we just don't always have on the historical record. And I would advise everybody to just have more modesty and to be more careful here on the probability and the weight of the sources in question. Yeah, and I bring up once again this point that he says that Clement of Alexandria was more extreme than Origen. That's wrong. Origen was more extreme than Clement of Alexandria. Origen actually, he praises the idea of outlawing artists in his book Contra Celsum, whereas Clement of Alexandria is willing to say, you know, let the art be praised, or yeah, let the art be praised for its beauty, but let it not lead men into madness. Basically, that's what he says. And I think it's like against the heathens. That's one or something like that. Leaving that aside, I just thought, okay, this is a really bad reading from Ortlund again on Origen compared to Clement of Alexandria. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that the fact that Origen becomes more extreme than his teacher is evidence that this is just Origen's opinion, right? They are just giving their own individual arguments. They are armchair philosophers, theologians. And so we have every right to argue with them and to question their premises. If they were giving me sacred tradition and they said, this is what the apostles taught and believed, okay, then that would be different. But given the fact that they are making their own Platonic arguments, their own observations about pagan culture, okay, then that's relevant to them. Let's assess it from a historical basis, assess the weight of the arguments from a theological basis. Does it hold up under good Christology or not? That's a very basic test, and see what would happen. And even Ortlund would find a lot of these arguments extreme. You know, Lactantius's Platonic arguments. He wouldn't agree with Plato's critique of art. So then I don't see why Catholics are bound to Plato, to Lactantius, to Origen in this conversation. And this quote reminded me, this whole thing reminded me of a line in The Young Pope, and I'm sorry to kind of go off topic here. There's a line in The Young Pope where one of the actors says, the young are always more radical than the old. Now, I would not recommend watching The Young Pope. I watched it not knowing some of the stuff that's in there. Haven't watched it again since. But I thought that was a great line because Origen, for some reason, just becomes more extreme than his own teacher, whereas his teacher, Clement of Alexandria, was much more nuanced with images. Okay, so I gave a new piece of evidence for icon veneration at the end of the 2nd century being practiced. I showed that even heretics in the late 2nd century were opposing image veneration on bad Christological grounds. I went into the topic of whether Nicaea, and I also talked about whether Nicaea II is a valid development. And so I just want to show you that, look, I've done the hard work right, to do all the research. I've done the hard work to read the council, to look at the scholarship, sat down with professors at Harvard to talk about this. One of them reviewed my essays, gave me an A. So I just want to say that at the end of the day, I know that it's really easy to just, go for a short video, to go for a summary, but really I'm trying to be 100% honest with you and give you all the evidence. This is why like my videos tend to go long. I know people are like, okay, Suan published another 4-hour video. It's because I care. And it's because I'm so serious about giving you the truth, because I know for a fact, not everyone has the time or money to read the Acts of Nicaea II. So I want to honor you by giving you the facts, being honest with you when I say, okay, no, some of these sources support Ortland's side. I want to be honest with you when I say, oh yeah, Nicaea II dances around the question. That's not a flattering thing to say about a council on whether or not it teaches that the apostles were venerating images, but I'm willing to say it, right? And even with all that honesty and all this rigor, I'm still coming to a conclusion that favors Roman Catholicism. And I know that some people might say, okay, this final plea is kind of meaningless, whatever, Suan. Okay, fair enough, right? But I just want to lay my heart and my intentions on the table that I have wrestled with this. There were times where I thought, okay, maybe Ortland's right here. But then I kept digging. I looked at the Greek. I looked at the sources. And now coming soon, you're going to see that with Brianna Elise Jansky and Daniel Jansky's publishing house, The Catholic Quill, the essays that I wrote, and you'll be able to see the evidence for yourself in all of its glory. Okay, let's now look at what people have said in the live chat. Okay, so I'm going to say this is Goat Edits. Hello, Suan. Question for you. Will you address Steve Christie's canon arguments one day? Perhaps. I've kind of moved on from the topic of the canon for various reasons, but maybe one day I'll circle back to it. Okay, let me see here. Orthodox Philip says, this is a critical point. Great work. Okay, thank you, Orthodox Philip. It's funny. When I debated Stephen Nimesh on whether Christ established an infallible church, all my Orthodox friends were saying, Suan, we're going to support you on this one because we're very, we support this conclusion. So we're cheering you on. And I hope that what I've done here with images and Nicaea II has honored my Orthodox friends. Of course, I think some of them want me to say that Nicaea II taught the apostles were venerating images, but I'm not going to say that because I don't think that's what the council says or requires or even needs to say. So there's that. The Good Fight with Tony L. Is this live or recorded? Live. Let's see here. Orthodox Philip says the horos of Nicaea II is beautiful and very well written, much better than the 754 iconoclast decree and the laughable decree of 815. Yeah, and then Orthodox Philip says Nicaea II doesn't say what the apostles were doing. This is a key takeaway. 100%. I will die on this hill and argue, for it, unto the ages of ages. Orthodox Philip asked, do you think Ortland will revisit the issue again? He seems burned out on it, last I heard. I have no idea if he'll revisit it. I am kind of skeptical if he'll ever respond to my research, because there's an advantage if you never respond to a criticism, because then, people won't know that it exists if you never respond to it, for the most part. A lot of Ortland fans have dismissed my videos for being so long or things like that. I've seen some of them comment what I supposedly have argued. And I'm like, that's not what I'm claiming. So there's a lot of lack of charity on a lot of sides here. But at the same time, though, yeah, I don't know if he's going to respond, but I'm more than happy to debate him on this. More than willing to debate him on this topic of images. I would specifically want to debate with him whether Nicaea II says if the apostles were venerating images. If it makes that one-for-one argument that the things that we're doing in the 8th century, we're doing them because the apostles were doing the exact same thing. I would debate him on that 100%, because the pious custom point, I think it just kind of showed he didn't read carefully the rest of the council. Because once you read the rest of the council and especially because the council is assuming that you read the other sessions, you start realizing that it wasn't claiming incensation and lighting candles is the pious custom of the men of old. MK Vine says, excellent presentation, Swan. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, Orthodox Philip says, we don't know what was on the walls of the Magdala synagogue, but we know it was painted. If it was anything like Dura Europos, it was full of images of saints and biblical scenes. So, right, that we have carved images in the Magdala synagogue. So that's why I'm saying we know that there were images in the Magdala synagogue. They were carved in stone. Now, you're right that there are a number of synagogues in the first century that seem blank, but potentially could have had paint on them, and the paint was just lost to history. So that's a valid point. Now, would it have gone as far as a Dura Europos? I'm not sure. The Moses Ostracon makes me somewhat optimistic about that. At the same time, though, the Moses Ostracon, I mean, for all we know, right, as historians, it could be a child's drawing, right? And that's it. So I just don't know. I just don't know if they would have painted human forms in synagogues. Let me keep going here. The Greek Catholic says you don't need the apostles to venerate images. That's a ridiculous take on how doctrines work, right? You don't need the apostles specifically to bow, kiss, and pray to images in order for us to be able to, down the line, be able to bow, kiss, and pray to images. That's not how that works. Nicaea II gives you an argument for how it can get from point A to point B to point Z. That doesn't require that at the beginning. Yeah, I remember I asked Gavin, I don't know if he said this in a live stream or in a private conversation, so I'm just going to preface that. I think it's public, but he said, like, what would be required? I think maybe it was a Facebook comment. Like, what would be required for you to believe that Eliakim had like a priestly office that was analogous to the papacy? And he said, oh yeah, if Eliakim defined a dogma. I'm like, really? Like, that just kind of struck me as like, well, incredibly demanding, but a little silly as an expectation. And 3 Squad 56 says, for fun, question, what has been one of the most interesting topics or mysteries of the Bible you like thinking about or exploring? There's too many, right? There's too many to just pick one. Yeah, I don't know if I can just pick one. I mean, I really love this topic of images in ancient Judaism and ancient Israel. I really enjoy topics related to, like some of the dark and difficult passages in the Old Testament. I actually enjoy meditating and thinking through how to approach this theologically, pastorally, historically, as an aspiring scholar of the Bible. I also find, I also find like the eschatology, the apocalyptic nature of Christ. And I know one of my professors is going to roll her eyes because apocalypse doesn't mean end of the world. It just means a revelation of some sort, hence the apocalypse of John. Or when Peter is shown that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of God, the Greek is related to the word apocalypse. This has been apocalypsed to you, Peter. That's what Jesus says. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. So, I mean, I find Jesus's eschatology really interesting, like especially questions on the delay of the parousia, the imminent end of the world, allegedly in the New Testament. One last thing, I find the ethnic relationship between Jews and Christians or Jews and Gentiles to be really fascinating. And also I find the authority of the high priest to be a fascinating topic that I have been wanting to get into, but haven't had the time, but I'm going to get into that because there are interesting implications for the authority of the high priest in ancient Judaism and how that parallels later ideas about infallibility, because the high priest was really viewed as a divine representative on earth, even in the first century. So I really want to look back in that authority. So I love questions about authority in the Bible, questions about authority institutions. Sorry, that's a very long-winded and jumbled answer, but there's my best shot. Okay, so the Good Fight with Tony L says, do you or anyone else in the publication address the issue of the anathema for those who don't salute images and what that means in practical terms? So I don't think anybody. Well, okay. Let me preface this by saying I don't know if anybody else addresses this. The question of the anathemas. I've wanted to address the question of the anathemas for a long time. Never got the chance because I've been focusing on the main other pillars that need to be addressed first. I will say personally that I think when I understood finally the arguments of Nicaea II and how it got from point A to point B to point Z, I think the anathemas are issued on reasonable grounds. I think it makes total sense. I think that what the Synod of Hieria was doing was actually dangerous for souls and deserved to be shut down. Because I didn't have time to get into like the whole Christological dimension of this debate, but just remember, if you say that the true God is invisible, then what are you saying about Jesus Christ, who is the true God and visible? I am a very, even when I was Protestant, I was a no nonsense guy about respecting the deity and the humanity of Jesus. And when I started realizing that Hieria was slander against God, against the Lord, it deserves the anathema. Now, of course, the church doesn't really work in that way of anathematizing opponents. So, and she has that right to do that, and I submit to her authority to do that. But I'm just saying, were I in the 8th century, or were I a Christian in the first millennium after the council, I would have thought, yeah, this makes sense. And then, obviously, in practical terms, an anathema I take to be a technical legal term, which is to say that just because you are, let's say, a material heretic, you believe in a heretical opinion or a position that contradicts a council, it doesn't automatically mean that you're damned to hell or that you've excommunicated yourself from the church. The question is, when you are corrected and maybe even brought before like a canonical tribunal and you still refuse the judgment of the church, then that shows obstinate, right? I mean, this is what, Canon 751 of the Code of Canon Law, just obstinance, disobedience, arrogance, pride, all the rest. But that to have the anathema actually applied to you is a legal, technical process, and that takes time. And so I wouldn't just say Protestants are anathema, especially Protestants today. I wouldn't say that like Gavin Ortland is anathema and doomed to hell because he rejects Nicaea II. I wouldn't say that. Let's see here. Okay, Tony L says he'll be releasing a video on patristic interpretations of Paul's rebuke of Peter. Oh, I have an essay coming out actually on that, and it's being published with Andrew Locutus edited the volume. It's like, what is it like? I forget. Anyway, it's a book that Andrew Locutus edited. Cardinal Robert Sarah contributed a chapter. So I'm very excited. Cardinal Robert Sarah might actually read my essay in that book, which deals with the authority of Peter in the early church, and it deals with the Galatian Antioch incident. Oh man, hold on. Let's see here. Let me get that book up really quick, because I want to make sure that if you want to get it, that it's called Faith in Crisis. That's what it's called, and it's published by, I think, Wolfenstock. Yeah, so, and Cardinal Robert Sarah contributed an essay to that, and I hope he reads my essay and he doesn't censure me or anything. Actually, the book itself got a nihil obstat and I think an imprimatur. So if I said that right, the Latin. But anyway, Roberto Tapia says, what's the newest book you're reading right now? I'm reading too many things at once right now, but the book that I've been sinking into is The Mysteries of Christianity by Matthias Joseph Shaban. And oh my gosh, it's beautiful. Shaban is such a rigorous writer. The handbook was a bit too dry for me, but I'm trying to get back into the handbook on Catholic dogmatics. But Mysteries of Christianity, it's like good technical theology written poetically, beautifully. It's marvelous. I remember reading it and I felt like I was just slowly falling into this larger intellect, and it was such a blissful delight. So I'm very excited to continue reading the Mysteries of Christianity. Sometimes when you're reading devotional material, sometimes, so for example, sometimes like when you're reading material, it's not like devotional, right? Because it's like very technical academic work and it's just kind of dry. This book, you could take, I don't know what your opinion is about this, but take it into like an adoration chapel or just quietly into the chapel or into, the church and just read it. And actually it would be very prayerful. Anyway, a mother forgiven by her son. What do you think of Gavin's new upcoming book responding to Michael Garton's icon book? Do you think it was already in the works since it's going to be published so soon? Oh, I don't know the answer to the second question, but I don't know. Yeah, Michael has done a lot of good work. I disagree with some of his interpretations of the early sources. I also am trying to recall if Michael thinks that Nicaea II actually teaches that the apostles venerated images, because I don't think you need to establish that. And I don't think the historical record is going to show you the apostles bowing, kissing, and praying to images like that. That's not to say one way or the other whether or not the apostles would have approved of the practice. Is just to say nothing on what they would have done with images in those specific ways. I think that the apostles would have recognized that images were good. They would have recognized that images have a place in the life of the church and for the memory of a saint or a deceased loved one. I think if they wouldn't have disapproved of images or Nicaea II. That's my belief. So let me see here. Okay. Tony L asked, sure, a tribunal is serious business. I just wonder what other contexts, like the liturgy or something, where the church would be observing the omission. I don't know what you mean by observing the omission. Yeah, so I would just need like specification there. But like, for example, if you like refuse to venerate an image, I think it comes down to the intention, right? Because clearly, that canon was issued at a time when things were really hot. And it would make sense why, like, for example, you would have to venerate an image when they just, anathematized the iconoclasts. Just like during the Cold War in America, every child in their public school was doing the Pledge of Allegiance, right, to build American morale and patriotism. It makes sense during that time, but obviously I think that if you were a Catholic and you consciously refused, then that's like a material heresy. That's materially problematic. It's not formally yet a heresy. If you were told, okay, here's why we do it, let me give you a good explanation, then that obligation would then kind of more strictly fall down on you. But still, for an anathema to be applied, it's a legal process. The Walking Meme says, what's the basic rundown on icons? Because TBH, I haven't read the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Hey, fair enough. It's a lot of pages. Okay, let me give the basic rundown. Images have had controversy throughout Christianity because some people thought that the book of Exodus, specifically the first or the second commandment, depending on how you read it, against graven images applies against them. A lot of people have noted that ancient Israelites, ancient Jews were cautious around images, but at the same time, though, now to the flip side, that has been overblown in Protestant scholarship, the concern over how hesitant ancient Jews or even ancient Israelites were towards images. You actually see a much more complicated picture. When Israel had times of security and the cult, the temple, the worship of God could be secured from pagan influences, you see an explosion of images. And precisely because God has images in the temple, it shows you that it's not the case that images are profane inherently. It's that images are so holy that God wants them to be used in the right way. Going forward then, Nicaea II's basic argument is that if you can venerate the saints, and the veneration principle is true, and they do argue it's apostolic, then you can venerate a saint through their image. What's the veneration principle? The honor given to an image goes to the one represented. If you just have those two ingredients, then you get Nicaea II. Now, there are relevant debates about Christology here, because the iconoclasts and other ancient, quote unquote, ancient Christian sources were claiming that the true God is invisible, and so there can't be images of God. Well, then what about Jesus Christ, who is the true God and visible, right? They were claiming that, yeah, the true God was invisible to such an extent that it becomes problematic when we develop our Christology and we recognize rightly and truly that Jesus Christ is the true God, and yet he is visible without conflict, without diminishing his divinity, so on and so forth. So there's that. Okay, so I got your question then, Tony L, on omission to salute the icon. Roberto Tapia says, you're the second person this week to recommend reading and recommending Matthias Shaban. That's right. Orthodox Philip says, as an Orthodox, I agree with your interpretation of Nicaea II. I also read the Acts and walked away with the same conclusion. My brother, praise God. All right, this is great. I'm so glad that like this isn't just the Roman Catholic Swan over here saying, oh, Nicaea II doesn't really address that question. A fellow Orthodox brother recognizes it as well. And brother, I just want to say God bless you, and I wish you all the best. So I think that's all I'm going to say for this stream. But seriously, when the essays come out on icon veneration, I really hope that you're able to read them. Please pay attention to the publishing house, The Catholic Quill, and the book on icons that will be coming out. You'll be able to get all my research. And so that in the future, whenever you see a Protestant raise arguments against images, you will have the playbook and you will know how to respond. I went into a lot of research, and I encourage you, please check out at least that book if you can't read all of Nicaea II. All right, God bless you, and thank you.